Good evening. My name is Karen Ferguson, and on behalf of the Graduate Program in Urban Studies at Simon Fraser University, the Department of First Nation Studies, and the Indigenous Research Institute at Simon Fraser University, I'd like to thank you for coming to the final talk of 2014 in our year-long speaker series on making space, contesting the city. This series is part of the Initiative in Urban Sustainable Development, which is generously funded by an endowment from the Real Estate Foundation of British Columbia and the Fraser Valley Real Estate Board. To begin this evening, I'd like to invite Deborah Sparrow from Musqueam to the stage to offer us a welcome. Thank you, Deborah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm sorry that I can't stay to hear the whole presentation, but I find that really interesting, making space for Indigenous urbanism. Gee, what does that mean? To us who live in our villages along the outside of Vancouver, what is now Vancouver, making space here for us, don't know how much space is left. Interesting. I think it's interesting, a great topic. One that maybe we're not thinking about as much in our own little places that we live, but maybe some of us are. And we would be really interesting to know what you're thinking and what that means to the city of Vancouver, who the mayor has announced that we are now on unceded, well, not now, but this is unceded territories of the Salish people. And what is life to them? What does it mean to them? Even what the title would mean to them. It'd be interesting to have that conversation with the tripart people who do live here. As I drove down to the city tonight, I always just shake my head and I'm amazed. In fact, I said that in my Facebook last night, be amazed. Maybe that amazes me, driving down here and looking at the mass amount of lights and the mass amount of people and wondering, where did everybody come from? But not only where did we come from, where are we going? You know, we have Kinder Morgan on our backs, we have many issues that we're dealing with, and if we're not careful, we won't have an earth to deal with it. I don't know how much oil we can suck out of the earth and it will still float. There's a reason why everything happens. There's a reason why the earth was created the way that it was, and how much can we take? And that's the thing that's important, is that we can keep building and building, and every time I drive down the city, I think every one of them have a bathroom. Oh my God. What about the big one, you know? I mean, are we ready? Are we really ready for what could happen? Are we prepared? Mentally, physically, spiritually, and hopefully, you know, we are. Hopefully the wonderful teachers that you have and the people who come as guests and share their information with you, it's all food for thought, and all of us together have to face these issues that are so very important to all of us when we talk about land and space and what it means to us as not only First Nations but all nations. So I'd like to thank Ryan for being here, and I wish I could hear your whole presentation, but unfortunately I have to go home to my little guy who has to go to school so he can become a builder because he loves to build Lego. So if he's building Lego, I said, maybe you want to build buildings? And he said, maybe I do. So we'll see what's going on when he's older and if there's room for buildings to still go up there. Thank you. So good luck to all of you tonight. Thank you very much. Hi, Scott. But before I go, I better give myself a little slap on the hand and say, on behalf of my chief, Wayne Sparrow, behalf of my council members, and behalf of my people, but mostly on behalf of my ancestors, for the reason that we exist, that I welcome you all to the unceded territory of the Salish people. My brother would never forgive me if I didn't remember that part. So, Haichka, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for providing that welcome. I'm particularly happy tonight to introduce our speaker, Ryan Walker, and his talk on making space for Indigenous urbanism. This is a long overdue topic for us to address as an urban studies program located in the Lower Mainland. As you say, the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and other Coast Salish First Nations. It's also overdue given that people belonging to First Nations from across Canada call Vancouver home. As you know, the majority of Aboriginal people in Canada are urbanites, and they constitute significant and fast-growing communities in cities across the country, and particularly in the West. However, this fact remains too often unacknowledged by non-Indigenous Canadians, including those who plan and design our cities to make space for their citizens. Indeed, urban planning in Canada, like all professions, has yet to fully contend with the history and legacy of colonialism and exclusion when it comes to Aboriginal communities, and to contend with these communities' rightful claims to self-governance. It's a great pleasure, therefore, to welcome Ryan Walker, who tonight will talk about Indigenous planning, or urban planning by and with urban Indigenous communities. As Professor Walker asserts, urbanists of the 21st century must develop new concepts and tools to support what he calls Indigenous urbanism, which he defines as the full participation in and enjoyment of urban life. And he's found examples large and small from around the world to illuminate steps forward towards that goal. Ryan Walker is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. He's the author of many publications and the recipient of many awards for his research and for his participation in urban planning and design initiatives to reclaim, as the title of one of his recent research collaborations put it, Indigenous planning. After Professor Walker's talk, we've asked someone who is a leader in Indigenous planning in our region to respond and to put his talk into a local context. Kamala Todd is a Cree, Métis, and German Vancouverite, or originally a Vancouverite anyway, who worked for many years at the City of Vancouver as the Aboriginal social planner, and she continues to work as a consultant with the city to help build greater Aboriginal inclusion and voice. Her multifaceted work as a community planner, filmmaker, facilitator, and writer is all focused on making space for Aboriginal stories and perspectives in our cities, which she's done through a number of recognized and award-winning initiatives, including the City of Vancouver Dialogues Project, an innovative cross-cultural project that has gained attention across Canada, and her facilitation of the historic government-to-government dialogue between the City of Vancouver and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. So, with no further ado, I will ask Ryan Walker to come to the stage to talk to us about making space for Indigenous urbanism. Thank you very much.
Being a better turn this. Oh, it is on. Okay, I'm glad I didn't say anything embarrassing earlier. This has been on the whole time. Thank you for your welcome, Deborah, and also Karen for your welcome and hospitality. And I'm very happy to be in the company of Kamala Todd this evening as well. I'm looking forward to hearing from her. A little bit later, can everyone hear me at the back okay? Yep, good. Okay, so I don't come here very often to... Oh, interesting. I did have it on mute. Must be this one that was projecting. Okay, so now I'm on twice. So I just want to pick up on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people and say how rare it is for me to come out here, but how important it is to keep that as the context for this evening's discussion. And so I'm very pleased to be here on the territory of the Coast Salish peoples. I'm from the prairies, born in Winnipeg, raised there, and also in Edmonton and St. Albert, and I lived for a time in New Zealand. You'll see a few examples this evening from New Zealand, mostly Canadian examples though. I don't try to pretend like I know what's going on in your city. You do. If you don't, hopefully the presentation will inspire you to find out more. I do have a couple of examples from Vancouver. I have worked here before, very briefly with one organization in particular in this city. But I hope that you'll forgive me for any ignorance that I may have about precisely what's going on in your community. There isn't a lot of text in this presentation, so don't worry. It's all at the front end. David Neuhaus is a scholar at Trent University, and he's the chair of Indigenous Studies there and also a colleague of mine. And him and Kevin Fitzmaurice, I think, really pegged an important issue with this quote, that the sort of the early 21st century, where we're situated at now in the research and practice community, is moving away from an exclusive focus on what they call the study of lack. And I think that's a powerful and simple way of thinking about a lot of the research that's been done on urban Aboriginal communities. It tends to come across characterizing the lack of housing, the lack of financial resources, the lack of justice in the criminal justice system, the lack of, well, you can fill in the blanks. Very much a lack of something. And it's a kind of a sensitive thing to start on because, I could be accused by just saying that I'm sort of just glancing across the very serious issues of disparity between Aboriginal communities on some of the socioeconomic indicators of quality of life and justice. And I don't want to glance across those and pretend that they don't exist, and I don't want to give myself or anyone else a free pass on coming to terms with our urgent responsibility for reconciliation and for accounting for the impacts of some of our settler experiments, like residential schools that broke the bridge of cultural transmission across generations, and what that did to transmission of worldviews and parenting and education and culture. I don't want to give myself a pass on any of that. But at the same time, I want to talk about what specifically might be considered some inroads in urban studies and in planning in the urban setting to moving beyond the study of lack and instead taking a future-seeking approach that is situated very firmly in the past, informing the present, and then looking forward to the future of Indigenous urbanism. And Indigenous urbanism itself, what is it? It's something that Neuhaus talks about again. It's something that I've really started to talk about. One of my primary areas is urban planning, urban geography, and I talk about urbanism all the time. Just a reasonable definition of urbanism to get us started, not Indigenous urbanism, just urbanism is the participation in and enjoyment of an urban life. In Saskatoon, where I'm from, the generation of people that are from my mother's generation, many of those people grew up on farms, around the city. If I were to speak with people about where they come from in Métis or First Nations communities, it may be a rural community, it may be a reserve. And what we're finding now with non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal people is that a larger number, the proportion is just growing, just more people are being born in the city, and so their sense of place and their sense of, the present and the future, although part of that is still, even if you're born in the city, part of your heritage and the important links that you have to community and kinship still stretch beyond the scale of the city very much throughout a traditional territory. But we're starting to see people really start to hunger for the participation in and enjoyment of an urban life, and to see themselves and the meanings that they ascribe to their place in the world circulating through what we see around us. This is a great room. We've got windows out here. It's not hard to imagine how out on a sidewalk, or if we were to look, if it was light out and look across the river, the buildings, the architecture, the street names, the signage, the public art, and the way that services are designed and delivered, the way that City Hall interacts with people, consultation processes, priority setting, all of these things can feed into the cultivation of Indigenous urbanism, that Indigenous enjoyment and participation in urban life, if it's done right. And if it's done right, and there's probably a lot of different rights, okay, and the key here is the process of determining, for your city and your community what is right. It also turns the strength of Indigenous cultures outward. And so it's not only something that enhances the cultural vitality of Aboriginal peoples in a city, but also non-Aboriginal peoples who start to have a profound attachment to their place in the world and the depth of the civic identity there, beyond just the simple basic settler narrative. So in terms of Indigenous planning, there's really two scholars that I credit the most for kind of developing that term, if you were to put it in quotes, Indigenous planning. And one of them is a guy by the name of Ted Hohola. He's from the Isleta Pueblo outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he's a professor in the planning program at University of New Mexico. And then another one is Hirani Matunga, who's a professor at Lincoln University, just on the outskirts of Christchurch in New Zealand, and he's seen as sort of the leading Maori planning scholar down under, I guess you might say. And both of them have converged on this notion of Indigenous planning. And I take a figure here that Hirani produced, that's why he's credited with it. And I think that this is a good place to start. Now, Hirani points out that both Ted and Hirani point out that Indigenous planning is something that's existed. Communities have planned for their futures, taken stock of their past and their present, and planned for the future for thousands of years. But with the settler publics that have come to countries like New Zealand and Canada and the United States, now with this sort of the regulatory and bureaucratic frameworks and sort of the Western concepts of place that have been superimposed on those territories, the challenge now is to, as the title of the book that Karen mentioned points out, to reclaim that Indigenous planning. Not that it doesn't exist, it simply, it needs to be reclaimed and brought up to the fore again. And in discrete Indigenous communities, it's still going on, but in urban contexts, it tends to be overshadowed a lot by sort of the processes of City Hall, for example. And one of the things that Hirani is very strong on is the need to recapture the materiality and the memory of Indigenous communities. And he uses Christchurch as an example, but you could think of Vancouver as well, where a lot of the structure and physical presence of Indigenous communities, the materiality of them has been sort of moved aside or buried or forgotten intentionally. And that's where we get into the memory as well. And the memory of Indigenous communities in those places has been erased from the urban landscape as well. And so when I talk about some of my examples here tonight, and this is kind of the heavier theoretical stuff I'm talking about now, we're going to get into a lot more photos in a minute. So I'll put you to sleep in the first 10 minutes, and then you'll wake back up when you see the pictures. But I want you to keep in the back of your mind these two concepts of materiality and memory. And no matter how small the example that I show in a photo subsequently, or no matter how big it is, think, does that have the potential to enhance the materiality and memory of Indigenous communities in these cosmopolitan urban settings that we live in now? And if so, do you see the potential for these things to cultivate a strong sense of Indigenous urbanism for Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities as well? Very important, as you see in the diagram, to all of the things that I talk about are the worldview that Indigenous communities bring to their communities and their processes, the vast importance of kinship and community themselves, and the importance of connection, an authentic connection to place, land, and resources. And I think that that's another important thing to just keep sort of reminding ourselves as we go through. So I'll give a few examples on each of these things, which I think taken together start to give a good picture of the different facets that we can think about in Indigenous urbanism. Now, of course, no sooner than I put up 5 points, you're going to think of 3 points that should be up there that aren't, and I'll probably think of some too when I leave, and your questions might spark some more discussion. But this is probably, if we're lucky, about what we'll get through in the next little while. And I start with relationship building for a reason. It's not just it's not just placed at the first because we need to have a first. I think it really is the first point of departure for a civic community. Think of it in terms of City Hall and Aboriginal communities, and think of City Hall as being a representative of the larger public. Okay, but relationship building is very important. It creates a place to stand. It creates the preconditions for a basic mutual, basically cultivating a mutual respect and a sense of coexistence in a place, and the authentic histories of both Indigenous and settler publics. And so one of the examples I like to use, because it's a particularly good one in Canada, is the declaration that was made by Edmonton City Council in 2005. Now this declaration, you can see the title of it there. This isn't actually the whole thing. I just took a little snippet out of it. I couldn't fit the whole thing on. If I were to open that link, basically what you would find is that it starts out with a recognition by City Council that Aboriginal peoples were there for thousands of years prior to the settlement of Edmonton, and that it was precisely because of the Aboriginal people's relationship to settlers, and you can think of fur traders in this case, and also their hospitality and stewardship, teaching people how to live in a very harsh environment, learning how to live in this new place, and intermarriage and bonds of social and community and trading relationships, not without their conflicts and problems, but the city of Edmonton takes the step of saying, we see you and we see your history and we accept your history, and in turn we move from that to the important role you've played in the actual development of the city of Edmonton. We also take account of the fact that there have been historic injustices that continue on into the present against Aboriginal people by non-Aboriginal settler state apparatus and communities, and that we look to the future and the great importance that Aboriginal peoples play in the future of Edmonton. And what I think is quintessentially important as well is a specific section on that basically says we recognize your autonomy, and that your autonomy to operate as communities in this place was never relinquished, and that you're continuing to pursue your own self-determination in the context of this city. And the declaration is made by the elected officials. Okay, so these are the councillors and the mayor, not the administration. The next stage, okay, if you look over at the Edmonton Urban Aboriginal Court, after this was done, basically City Council says to their administration, now you guys make this happen. So now these are the administration folks, the staff people at City Hall, and they go out and start working with Aboriginal communities in that city through a variety of dialogue processes to come up with a set of principles that will guide the working relationship between Aboriginal communities in the city of Edmonton. And one of them is relationships. The second one is agreements. There will be agreements on areas of mutual interest and concern. There will be celebrations of achievements together. And there will be a continuous attention to the renewal of the relationship between City Hall and Aboriginal communities, or the people of Edmonton and Aboriginal communities. And so taken together, these are very powerful, and they also point out I know City of Vancouver had a year of reconciliation, And in 2014, the new mayor, Don Iveson for Edmonton, declared that to be the year of reconciliation. So we're still in it for the city of Edmonton, almost 10 years on, renewing that commitment. So that's sort of, and the reason why I put up this other one here, the Community Accord, okay, now this is Powell River and Sliammon First Nation, and this is a smaller community, and I tend to focus on bigger cities, but I put that one in. Why? Well, one, I'm in BC, but two, that one is the first one I ever became aware of. Now, I'm not saying that means it's the first one. I'm saying it's the first one I was ever made aware of that I could find of a relationship between, since 2000. In 2003, this was struck, community accord between the settler government and First Nation governments there. And it was before the Edmonton Accord. It often gets overlooked because it's a smaller center, but I think it paved the way for some of the larger centers to undertake work like this. I'm going to keep looking at my watch to make sure I don't go on too much. It's my curse. So I want to talk now a little bit about social planning, and this is where I get really excited about Vancouver, because one of my favorite urban Aboriginal organizations in Canada is right here in Vancouver, called Luma Native Housing Society. And the reason why I like this organization so much, I mean, I'll be honest, it's because I've met their staff and their CEO and the architect that often works with them many times. And I meet them over the last 10 or 12 years, and I've met them in all the right places, doing all the right things that they've been doing to try and enhance their community here. And so I wanted to, as my example of the role of urban Aboriginal organizations in cultivating Indigenous urbanism, I wanted to use them as an example. I also have one from Winnipeg, but there are examples of these organizations all throughout the city, okay? And during a period of time in sort of the 1900s, and really accelerating from the 1950s onwards with the evolution of friendship centers in response to urbanization trends of Aboriginal peoples moving from outside of the city into the city. A lot of these organizations were spawned from the Friendship Center movement. So the Friendship Centers would get, would hear from the people moving into the city that they were experiencing some kind of difficulty in a certain sector. Let's take housing, for example. Okay, maybe private and public landlords were exhibiting a fair bit of racism towards Aboriginal households moving in, and so they weren't able to find a place to live. So friendship centers started to do things like hatch housing committees, and they would end up spawning organizations that would hive off and turn into a nonprofit and focus on that sector. And you can see that in health as well. You can see it in a variety of different areas. And so Luma started in about 1980, and under a different name, which I can't remember, but they have done a lot. They've got over 300 units of affordable housing in the city. But they have done a lot to create partnerships with other Aboriginal organizations to help manage and develop new properties to meet new social goals. So this picture here is of the David Pronto Aboriginal Children's Village. And for those of you from Vancouver here that know your way around, unlike me, it's at Grandview Highway and Nanaimo Street. Basically, it's a 24-unit building for foster kids and their families, but the concept here is that the foster child is the one that gets to stay if the family breaks up. So oftentimes foster kids, if the parents, have a change of heart or can't, keep caring for the child has to move somewhere. But at this place, the child stays, the foster parents have to leave. And the architect for this project is a Niska architect by the name of Patrick Stewart, who does a lot of work in Vancouver. And he was a foster kid. And so there's a little bit of himself in it, but there's also, this project was managed with a variety of partners, but managed by Luma Native. This is a Luma Native housing project, and it just opened last year. So these guys are still very active. They've done a variety of other things too. I'm just giving that one example. But this one is from Winnipeg. This is an organization called Gunnigani Chick. I'm told that it means those who lead in Cree. And this organization was started by a woman who used to be the speaker for the Mother of Red Nations Women's Council of Manitoba. And in her long career, she was learning a lot about the need to develop leadership among people and to have elders providing that sort of cultural transmission and stewardship to cultivate young leadership. And the reason why I highlight this organization is because one of the things that they've done is they have reclaimed the settler orientation function that Indigenous peoples of the past used to have. So if you can sort of imagine back when people were coming over from Europe and trying to figure out how to live here with Indigenous communities, being the teachers and sort of the initiators, the receptor communities to these new migrants. Okay, well that sort of relationship to new migrants kind of got broken down and is now often, when new immigrants come to Canada, they're often taken, first under either sort of a Government of Canada type organization or a newcomer-based organization. Maybe it's an Iranian community organization that is there for Iranian migrants to Winnipeg. Well, what they did at Gunnigani Chick was they picked up that lineage of welcoming and educating and creating social bonds with immigrant newcomers. And so they actually, when people move over to Winnipeg from other countries, oftentimes facing similar socioeconomic circumstances and oftentimes coming from post-colonial countries themselves, now the face of this urban Aboriginal organization is the one that creates those social relationships and cultural bonds at the outset. And what this is a picture of here, both of these are one particular program that they do. Well, actually, there's a couple blended together. United Against Racism, Aboriginal Youth Circle, and the Youth Peace Building Gathering, which is like a summer camp in partnership with some immigrant newcomer organizations as well. So if you look over there, you see some happy kids that are out at the Youth Peace Building Gathering camp. And here's one of the lessons by the team leader from Gunnigani Chick, Albert McLeod, who's doing some teaching here. And I think that development of intercultural relations is such a powerful thing. And it really got started when Gunnigani Chick was taking a look around where they had their office, and they were noticing that in the neighborhoods in the inner city of Winnipeg, there were new migrant communities coming over and living in these inner city neighborhoods, and there were Aboriginal people living in these city neighborhoods, and they didn't like each other or trust each other. And so they thought, we've got to get into the schools, we've got to get into and start working with the kids, with the parents, and start to teach them about Aboriginal history here and First Nation and Métis and so forth, and the opposite. So, they'll have an African drumming circle at this camp, and they'll have, a variety of local Indigenous cultural teachings as well, and then just a lot of good friendship building. So I think that making space for Indigenous urbanism has to happen at the smallest, possible space of neighborhood level interaction, school level interaction. So yeah, you can have that relationship building, but you always have to imagine working from both sides, the high level stuff and the smaller scale stuff. And you can flip those around really easily too and say that the relationship building is actually the lower level stuff because you need it in order to have a place to stand and talk about other things, and then moving up from there. So now I want to talk about a few examples that relate to growth and development. Okay, so this starts to get into some more traditional land use planning stuff, which is quite interesting. Just make sure I'm staying on course. Okay. So in Saskatoon, what these are urban reserves, okay? I don't know if that's a concept that's familiar to you. Basically, you'll have a principal reserve. So let's pick one of them here, Muskeg Lake Cree Nation. So Muskeg Lake Cree Nation is up there somewhere. You know, quite a fair little drive. Within 2 hours, I can't remember exactly how far it is. Might even be like within an hour. You can tell I haven't actually been to Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, hey? Only the urban reserve. Anyway, the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, this is an urban reserve. So their principal reserve is somewhere else. It's roughly in the orbit of the city of Saskatoon. And in fact, it's within 200 kilometers, I can tell you that much. Depends how fast you drive. And there's Little Pine First Nation's got a land holding there in green. But the red ones are urban reserves. And so basically, what happens is a First Nation acquires a parcel of land on a willing buyer, willing seller basis with their financial resources. And in provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, there's been a treaty land entitlement framework put in place back in the 90s, which basically took stock of the fact that under the numbered treaties there in those provinces, a certain amount of land in acres was promised based on population size First Nations. And in some cases, that acreage got eroded or was never allocated in the first place. So the treaty land entitlement process was to basically figure out how many were owed and then to provide financial resources rather than the land itself, but the financial resources to acquire land on a willing buyer, willing seller basis. And so what some First Nations have done is they say, well, we're not going to try and acquire that farmer's field adjacent to our principal reserve. We're going to go to Saskatoon and we're going to buy a lot downtown. And we're going to build a commercial building, or maybe we're going to build something else. You know, anything's within the realm of possibility. And so these red dots are those urban reserves. And the first one that was created in a large city in Canada was in Saskatoon. It was called the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation in the Sutherland industrial area up here. And when it first was developed in 1988, and under the leadership of the Muskeg Lake Band Council at the time, and a very progressive mayor who really wanted to push through public opinion and make this happen. It had your usual concerns from local citizens who were thinking, urban reserve, what the heck is that? Do I want one next door to me? I don't think so. That sounds really different, really scary. I'm not sure what's going to happen. Well, they got a dentist. They got a sports store, they got a cafe, they got a bunch of offices, and the response afterward was great. We like it. It's good. It's good for the neighborhood. But it's that apprehension at first that made this very novel, and they pushed through. The leadership pushed through. It can be as small as a gas station. One Arrow First Nation in Saskatoon. This is just a gas station in an inner city neighborhood, and this one was just passed as an urban reserve. Just last month, and this is Yellow Quill First Nation. And Yellow Quill, this is right downtown. They're going to build a big office building here, and the first tenant they've recruited is the First Nations Bank, which is currently in the building next door. So they're going to have First Nations Bank. It's a gravel parking lot now. They bought the land, but it takes time under the Indigenous to Reserve policy, the federal government level, to apply. The big things that come into play creating an urban reserve are that the municipality and the city and the First Nation have to work out a financial agreement so that money is paid in lieu of taxes to the municipality, because they don't pay municipal property taxes. But if they want the piped water, run onto the lot, if they want the fire department to come when there's a fire, et cetera, garbage collection, they have to pay for the service. So they get an agreement in place to approximate what they would get in taxes. And they draft a land use compatibility agreement. So if this area here is zoned for, Class A commercial, the First Nation is not going to be able to, under their agreement that they negotiate, develop what would be highly incompatible? How about a waste incineration site? Okay, just to be dramatic about it, and then they have to have a joint conflict resolution clause and process in place so that they can keep that relationship strong and renewed. So this is something there's about 50 of these in Saskatchewan now. There's also a lot of them in Manitoba, especially in smaller communities in Manitoba. and there's about another 45, 50 that are slated. It takes time for the land holdings, okay, these green dots, to then turn into red dots if they choose. And some choose not to. Some choose to keep the land just on the open market, because if it's reserve status, you can't simply turn around and sell it. Okay, it's now, it's now reserved land. You can't simply go and sell it next year. Whereas if you just hold the land as a fee simple holding, you could sell it next year if you wanted to anyone. Now, one of the things that we found out in Saskatoon was the importance of actually working with First Nations, almost like you would work with anyone that you wanted to come and develop in your community, to actually kind of go and woo them and try and get them to invest the resources in the city. So something kind of disappointing happened. Cowessess First Nation from further in the south of Saskatchewan acquired this land. They didn't talk to the city when they did it. They just went and bought the land and they thought, well, the city's growing rapidly. You know, it's going to be a great purchase. Well, the city's future development plans were all up in that direction and that direction. So the city's not growing over there. And so by not communicating, you basically get a parcel of land that is just right literally on the outskirts of where it's developed. But Saskatoon's already developed in that direction as far as they want to go for years. So you can appreciate the importance of building that relationship. And these urban reserves are a way to bring back that materiality and that memory in a contemporary urban setting. And, you know, it's not always the most obvious, dramatic examples of indigeneity. It can be something like that as well. This is just a shot of the first one to go up in Winnipeg. This was just approved. Just launched officially. It's been going on for a few years, but just last year again, the Long Plains First Nation got this one going. If anyone's familiar in Winnipeg, it's around close to Polo Park. Okay, so it's still in the inner part of the city, and that's the first one in Winnipeg. So that's a big deal. And now I want to just look at some examples from New Zealand about. So we're moving beyond urban reserves now, and what I want to talk about now is entire new subdivision developments. Okay, so in this case, what I'm showing you here is around Christchurch, and basically the Ngaitahu tribe in the South Island of New Zealand, with their resources, they have developed whole new residential subdivisions to sell on the open market, not only to Maori people or tribal members, but to anyone, just develop and sell housing. But what they're doing is that in doing that, they are applying some cultural practices and environmental practices that are important to them. And so those practices turn that indigeneity outward to the broader community there again. And here you get the Wigram Skies master plan, and that's just a little bit of their branding up top, and you can see a sign entering into the community. And what they did here was, in a nutshell, they commemorate the history of that area with street names, place names, and the plants that are planted, native plants as well. They have a very, very strong cultural affinity to their water bodies, the river, and so they have a very, very ambitious stormwater retention process there that was non-negotiable for them. They consult with the local iwi, the tribe, tribal members before they apply for a development permit from the city of Christchurch. And so they get input before the concept, then they get input into the detailed design process. They have blessing ceremonies at the construction phase when they're breaking ground. They pay particular attention to archaeological processes in the area and honor those very, very much. And then again, ceremonies at opening. And that's just a few examples. There's more to it than I would know, but that gives you a bit of a sense. This, a couple of elders from the local Maori community here in another neighborhood called Te Wharaki, which is still being built out now. And this was a garden where they planted a lot of varieties of flax, which are used for weaving among Maori in New Zealand, to commemorate a woman who was a master Maori weaver who carried the weaving art and craft out and became famous in reviving it around New Zealand. And this park is to commemorate her, and some of the elders coming out to be a part of that and actually plant some of the flax. And there's a variety of features in the design and some of the information boards and things in there that commemorate this. And so this is a neighborhood park where Maori and non-Maori are going to be living and using. And I just put these up. I don't want to talk much about them, but I just wanted to put them up just to show that, you know, this isn't some remote concept, this whole new development of whole areas. In Canada here, right here in Vancouver, the Jericho Garrison and RCMP headquarter lands and some of the Coast Salish people here that are in a partnership with, what is it called, the Canada Lands Company. If you go over to Winnipeg and the Kapiong Barracks, again, some surplus military land. This one's a bit more problematic. It's been hung up in the courts for a long time because of a challenge. Basically, under the Treaty Land Entitlement Framework in Manitoba, when the federal government has surplus lands, they were supposed to go to the First Nations and find out if they wanted to buy them first under Treaty Land Entitlement. They went straight to Canada Land Company. And so First Nations challenged that, and one court decision supported them, and I think they're still kind of tied up in appeals and things, but I can't claim to be able to follow it day by day, but it's been more contentious. But there again, big chunk of land for redevelopment right in the city. And then in Ottawa, the Algonquins of Ontario entered into a relationship with the Canada Lands Company there as well to develop this urban land. And there they have a consultation working group, the Canada Land Company and the Algonquins of Ontario at CFB Rockcliffe land. And the Algonquins are engaged in all stages of the concept development for that land and the land use planning and the detailed design. And then there's also an opportunity for the Algonquins to acquire a defined number of lots and blocks, whole blocks in the area under the municipally approved plan, sort of as a first right before those go on to the open market. And so the other thing that they're committed to in that partnership is the commemoration of history and connection of Algonquins with the site. So I think these are very powerful examples of things occurring across Canada. So one of the things now that I want to talk about is the power of design. And this is where you might see a few examples where you're like, really? I mean, that's kind of small, you know? That's not a big ticket item. How is that important? And I just want you to imagine, though, the power of seeing yourself in the urban landscape and the sort of the meanings that you attach to that place and proudly feeling that you're presented in the urban landscape, whether it's something as simple as a street name. So in St. Albert, they've got Cree names under the English names of you know, a lot of the main streets there now. I mean, you know, some of these things sound really simple, but when we talk about Indigenous urbanism and bringing the materiality and the memory of Indigenous communities back into these metropolitan and cosmopolitan settings, I think every little bit counts. And oftentimes it's not just the end result, it's actually the process of getting there. And process becomes so important. So let me give you an example. This is one of my favorite examples. In Saskatoon, down at River Landing, which is sort of our waterfront signature public space in the downtown, we've got two elders there, Malvina Eagle from the Dakota Whitecap First Nation and Katie Poundmaker from the Poundmaker Cree Nation. And there were some other elders as well. The City of Saskatoon's urban design team assembled an advisory committee of elders to advise them on the kinds of things that First Nations would have been doing at that area, secular things, so not sacred things, but secular things they would have been doing in that area prior to the coming of the temperance colonists led by John Lake, you know, in the late 1800s. And so the elders told the stories, and some of them that were a little bit more design-oriented actually had a pretty heavy hand in the actual design that then was cut into the tree guards, the tree grates. And you got a set of 6 or 8 of these that are all over River Landing. And there's just one example there of the grass dance ceremony. And two of the elders there. and the process was excellent. If you talk to those elders, I've only talked to one of them, Katie Poundmaker, and this is a great highlight for her. She really enjoyed being a part of this. And it's sometimes these little things that really reflect. I mean, we talk so much about policy. We talk so much about the big things, the relationship building stuff. That's all incredibly important, but you got to come at it from all of these different angles, and don't stop. Just keep peppering in the small changes, and when you see an opportunity to implement a good process with people, and when it's done right, and they can see themselves in it, and they feel like, you know, it was done properly, it can be very powerful. A few examples here from Ottawa again, and here I just want to draw your attention to Lansdowne Park. And so Lansdowne Park, which is a prominent park that houses Ottawa's farmers market, among other things, is undergoing a revitalization. And the City of Ottawa and the Algonquins of Ontario, again, have gotten together, and basically what I've pointed out here are a few features of the revitalization project. One is to create the interlocking stone pavers, which is at the site where the farmers market is held, the outdoor portion. And these reflect a weaving pattern for food vessels of the Algonquins, that area. And so in consultation with them, you get this paving pattern for Ottawa's farmers market. Here you get ethnobotanical gardens, which will have a variety of plantings important to Algonquins, but also to a multicultural community of Ottawa, so not just Indigenous. And then up here is a teaching circle designed again in consultation with the Algonquins. And although you don't see them here now, these are just placeholder images, these trees. 7 trees of cultural significance of the Algonquins are going to be placed around there and around the park. And the reason why those are just placeholders is because they're still in, this is very, very much an ongoing project, they're still in those consultations to figure out what those will be. And then even, you know, if you get into, you know, the architecture of a place, and here, right here in Vancouver again, now this is another building by Patrick Stewart, that same Niska architect. This is one that he designed in 2004, again with Luma Native Housing Society. And this one's called the Artzulkol Aboriginal Patients Lodge. And so it's at East 8th Avenue near the intersection with Clark Drive. And basically here what you get is people that are traveling, Aboriginal community members that are traveling from out of the city for health reasons to the city, and maybe a family member needs health attention, but the family needs a place to stay while they're here. They can stay short term in this building. And then there are people that have affordable housing units permanent in other parts of that building, and they kind of act as host families to the people coming in. And they've also got some other support services there, like shuttle services to get people to their appointments and so forth. And it's a wonderful building, very well designed, and that's another example of powerful Indigenous architecture, but also, like with the Children's Village, the kind of thought process that goes into programming that building. You know, it's not just oh, look, we put a totem pole at the front. It's actually the whole process of setting the program for the site and the building and the spaces within it. Here, this was my babysitter growing up, St. Albert Place, when my mother was doing night courses to be an accountant. She used to drop me off here. Main branch of the St. Albert Public Library, City Council chambers, the art gallery, the main theater, Ardent Theater of St. Albert, in this downtown main civic complex designed by Douglas Cardinal, Blackfoot and Métis heritage from Alberta. And this wonderful building, which plays well with the Sturgeon River and is got a beautiful interior design as well, is another example of how cities can really privilege these design concepts for their main buildings. The one at the bottom, this is on the Taranaki Wharf in Wellington, New Zealand. Okay, this is called Te Raukura. It was given the name in 2011, and there's 3 parts to this complex. One is a building to house 2 traditional canoes, and another is a conference and event center, and then a third is an eating house. And And this is right on the most prominent place on the waterfront. And this goes out to the area where up to the late 1800s, the local Maori community, that was their waterfront area, the waterfront reach of that community, which had been relocated, I was going to say dislocated from their traditional spot, but now again, right out there on the waterfront. So again, sort of reclaiming that place, re-territorializing the city according to the Indigenous communities. And we're just about done here. And I timed myself when I started, and according to my watch, I have 3 minutes left, so I'm gonna rock here. This just sort of wayfinding and signage. I'll give you just one example from Manitoba. The province's highways department and the Manitoba Métis Federation got together to basically create signage to go along highways to welcome people to the jurisdiction of the local Métis government. So communities, you know, town of Swan River, for example, or St. Rita in this case, have their local town governments, town councils. But the Métis locals that operate there wanted to have a welcome sign as well to their community. So this is just one example of that. Below, you can see on the Confederation light rail line that's being built in Ottawa, one of the stops close to Chaudière Falls and Victoria Island that's of traditional importance to the Algonquins of Ontario again, Le Breton Flats, was basically designated a station to be named, designed, landscaped, and have public art done by the Algonquins. The Algonquins named it the Pimisi Station, which is Algonquin for eel, which is of great importance at Victoria Island, Chaudière Falls for Algonquins historically. And so you get that aspect and sort of the new infrastructure of the city as well, people being familiarized with the place history there and the local art. And that art will also carry through to other aspects of the Confederation line. And then finally, civics, and I don't want to give this any, less, I don't want to suggest that this is any less important than any of the other things, but I think that this is the area that we talk about the most, which is the governance relationship. So I sort of purposely flip it and talk about it the least. But it's so incredibly important. So when cities are working with Aboriginal communities and they want to undertake future-seeking processes together, planning, policy documents, it's important to co-produce them from the concept phase, like problem identification, issue identification, through to the plan, through to the implementation, through to the evaluation of how it worked, not simply to consult, late in the process after City Hall has determined something to be a priority. And when you have a strong relationship built, you can co-produce things like that because you don't always have to start back at square one. You've already got a place to stand, to work together. Urban Indigenous councils are something that are, in some places working, in other places people are trying them. One interesting example in Auckland, okay, so the city of Auckland in New Zealand, the largest city in New Zealand, and with the largest Maori population as well, that's on land that was gifted to Auckland, city of Auckland settlers, by the Ngāti Whātua tribe there, which is still very much present in that area. And what they have done in the new Auckland Supercity is they've created a Maori statutory board that sits and advises the Auckland City Council, on which you may have Maori councillors as well, on the priorities of that city, the Maori community, and how to sort of infuse Indigenous urbanism, so to speak, into the day-to-day operations of government. And so, sometimes councils are quite formal like that. Sometimes they're more advisory. City of Edmonton, since 1994, has had an Urban Affairs Advisory Committee that does more soft advisory, things with City Council. And the duty to consult. And here we always look back to BC for charging ahead on this stuff, whether it was the Haida with the tree farm licensing in 2004 against government of British Columbia, which really brought back up the need to duty to consult where there may be Aboriginal rights asserted, and then to accommodate. those rights. And then, of course, the Chilcotin case that happened not too long ago. We're pushing forward on regularizing the duty to consult. And one of the great areas that I see in the future for municipal government is where the Crown, passes that duty down fully to be administered also at the local government level. Right now, it's too easy for local governments to say, oh, that's a Crown responsibility. We're not the Crown. But it becomes a local government responsibility when the Crown says, it's yours because you administer on our behalf. You're a creature of the province, so to speak. So that's a great area of future promise. And so in closing, I wanted to put up the cover of the book. Some of you that are interested in planning and reclaiming Indigenous planning might find some of the chapters of this book interesting. The library's probably got it. It's a good book. It's got 3 parts. I won't go through it. The image there is one of Cathedral Square after the 2010 and 11 earthquakes in Christchurch. Now, the whole identity of Christchurch was its Englishness as a settlement community, okay? And the Anglican Cathedral, the Christchurch Anglican Cathedral, was at the heart of the Cathedral Square, which is at the heart of the city, the signature public space. And it basically came down in the earthquakes. And it was soul-destroying, literally soul-destroying for the city. And they are going to demolish the rest of it. They're not rebuilding it, by the way. That was the Anglican church that decided that. And what I like about this is that someone went and erected the frame of a Maori wharenui, which is a big house. It's like a cultural center of Maori communities, out in front of the church. And to me, this really kind of captures almost, well, truly symbolically, the reclamation of the materiality and the memory of Indigenous communities in settler cities like ours. And it's such an exciting project for people that want to undertake it, and I hope all of you will in your own ways. And we're having a conference in Saskatoon next year. I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't invite you all to come out to the Canadian Institute of Planners conference in Saskatoon in June. So, thank you.
So, Tansei, Nia Kamala. I have the honor of responding and sharing some of my own ideas and reflections. So, I myself was born and raised here in Vancouver, but I'm not from here. I'm not Coast Salish. I'm Cree Métis and German, but I consider myself extremely blessed to have been born here, and my children were born here, and very grateful to my Coast Salish hosts. Great way that Ryan ended that talk in terms of thinking about the visibility. And so I just want to reflect a little bit and get all of us to reflect in thinking about how well we know the stories of where we live and why that would matter. And especially if you're planners or decision makers or in any way involved in placemaking and thinking about how we live on the land in our urban environments, the stories of our place really matters. So I like to think about what are the origin stories of where we live. Who is named, who is commemorated, who is sort of officially named as the founders of your city, of where you live. So in the case of where I live, I've grown up surrounded by the narrative and the myth of Vancouver as a place built by the Great White Fathers, as a place that was carved out of an empty land and a wilderness. Of course, much has changed, but that's still very much the narrative that has been written into the landscape. And this matters because the stories of a place and who is deemed to be the caretakers and kind of the norm and kind of the dominant culture, the essential public of that place, that determines how the city is shaped, that determines the kind of culture of that place. It shapes very much what are said to be our values, who we are as a community, who we are as a culture, and what we need to defend, what we need to preserve and maintain and continue to build. And so we all know that colonialism very much meant erasure and kind of a discounting of Indigenous landscapes and cultures. And so as we think about ways that we now do a lot of this cross-cultural work, as we look at how to re-territorialize and how to be more inclusive and build relationships and all of those important things, I like to kind of bring it down to the land and thinking about how do you shape your own land and where you live, and how much of a say and how much of a role do you have in that yourself, and how much that's influenced by who you are. I think about young people and the role they might have in having an influence on the land that they live in. I consider it a human right to live on your land according to your culture, your laws, your aesthetics, your science, your practices and the things and the ways you've always done things. And for some of us, that isn't an option. And so in this sort of remaking of the city and in all this wonderful reconciliation work, to me, it's also about rewriting the story of where we live. And so looking at the dominant narratives of where I've grown up, the Coast Salish people have been written out of the story to the point where many people who live here have no clue who the Indigenous people are. I always give this example because I used to work at the City of Vancouver, and when I started there in about 2000, I like to look at how the story of Vancouver is represented and who's included and how that story is told. And so I looked at the City of Vancouver's website to see how they explain the history of Vancouver and in particular First Nations. And they didn't have anything on their own website, but they linked to some sort of generic tourism website. And that generic tourism website said that in Vancouver's people, the First Nations who used to live here were Haida. So that's in 2000. And to me, I always give that as a perfect example of just the lack of connection and that kind of erasure. And it's when you don't, when those things aren't visible, when the people and their stories and their culture aren't visible, it's very easy to continue to build according to your own values and to pretend that you're not accountable to something deeper and that you're not accountable and responsible to the Indigenous laws and expectations and protocols that have been here for a very, 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 very long time. So I like to think, in looking at the examples of the work that we all do in our various ways, about ways that the language, the cultures, the continuity of the local people, how those things can be more present, how they can be written back onto the land, and how are local people doing that? And they've been, doing that for the whole time, trying desperately, to have a presence, to have a say, to resist, to object, to continue to practice as much as they could in their own ways. And I don't want to represent Coast Salish culture, but in all the stories and things that have been generously shared with me, largely through my work as a community planner, but also as a filmmaker, spending time going and talking to people and listening to those stories. The understanding that I have of this place as I go through it has been transformed because of that knowledge. And I firmly believe that the more people, locals, visitors, newcomers, decision makers, the more we know those stories, the more we hear those voices, the more we see the language, the aesthetics, things like the weavings and the blankets and the Coast Salish art, which is very distinct, the more we see that all around us, the more we hear about, the big house culture, the more we hear about, all of the significance to the people here. Because as I was told, and as Deborah said earlier, the local stories belong to all of us. If you live on this land, you are connected to those stories. You can't live on this land and be separate from that. And the same would be for all cities across Canada, because I would say that they are all Indigenous cities. So I refer to Vancouver and all the cities across North America really as Indigenous cities. We all have that wherever we go. And so the more that those are present and the more that the local people can be involved in telling their stories of their places and shaping what happens on their land, then planning will happen in a much different way. And the sense of inclusion and participation will be really rooted in that sense of place and where we stand and what are the origin stories of where we stand. Thank you.
So thanks very much for a great talk, great commentary on it. So I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. And thanks, Ryan. If you wouldn't mind coming up to the mic to ask your questions too, so that would be great. Thank you.
Does anybody have examples, local examples of things that some of the local nations are doing or in your own cities? Like Ryan was sharing, I'm curious.
Good evening. I just wanted to point out that here in British Columbia, the urban reserves are actually fairly common, but not because they were planned that way. Rather, the city just grew up around them, like Musqueam and Capilano. But there was one urban reserve that was created in the little town of Mackenzie, north of Prince George, where the local Gunnigani First Nation completed a treaty land entitlement. And rather than just taking rural land, one part of their settlement was for several acres within the town of Mackenzie, because they do a lot of business there, and it made sense to have a presence there within that community. And it's actually working. It's actually one of the success stories from that arrangement.
It's interesting.
That does to me, I just wanted to quickly mention the whole idea of the urban reserve too, because I think that idea of Indigenous urbanism as participating in urban life can in some ways suggest a sense of assimilation, because for a lot of people, yes, they're urbanized because their traditional territory has been urbanized. And so that's why I mentioned the whole idea of the right to live on your land according to your own culture. And so how can we support people who have had a city grow up around their traditional territory? How can we support them to continue to, be within the city, but also practice their culture? Yeah.
I was just curious if you, if you had any information about the Squamish. Can't remember the exact name, but you can actually follow a journey up the highway to Whistler. If anybody can talk about that, I don't know if anybody in this room can talk about that, or you guys, because there is something that you can follow the journey. There's little spots on the highway about Squamish people and within that area and stuff.
Yeah, it was during the Olympics.
It was during the Olympics, yeah. But isn't it still there or no?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I was just curious if anyone could talk on that, but maybe not.
I think there were a lot of really cool initiatives that came out of the Olympics and people trying to, again, I really love the Tsleil-Waututh Nation's expression that how they want to put the face of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation back on the map of their traditional territory. Oh, is it burning? Can we not
burning.
just turn it off?
Yeah. Oh, that's so classic. I love it.
Good save. I think that's a good example. So that, like I said, the Tsleil-Waututh Nation talks about their work is putting the face of Tsleil-Waututh back on the map of their traditional territory. So, writing yourself back onto the land. So I think that's a very good example. There's not a lot of that in Vancouver itself. I think there's a lot of emphasis on Squamish and up the way to Whistler. So, there's a few examples here, and it's slowly happening. And I will say that for me, even as a planner, public art and marking and mapping is a really big focus, because I think seeing it, as you said, in the built environment and seeing those stories and those narratives and that language and the images are huge to really affirming this as an Indigenous place, and however the people want to do it.
Yeah. One short example of something that's happening now in Edmonton is they're in the early stages of planning what they're calling Aboriginal cultural hubs. It's kind of, they want to have, they're basically taking stock of where different places of relevance to the Aboriginal community are, whether they're a shop, a business, a historic place. There's Rossdale Flats, which has some burial ground, and there's a variety of things, but all kinds of different nodes, if you want to think of them that way, and public art, you know, a little bit. And actually, it's one of Kamala's relatives, Zoe Todd, who's kind of an interview that she did in Spacing magazine really familiarized me with what they're doing there, and so they're trying to do some subtle wayfinding, sort of design processes to kind of direct people in ways that they can connect these nodes, these Aboriginal nodes or hubs around Edmonton. So I'm not exactly sure what they're going to come up with, but I'm kind of watching that space to see how it turns out.
Yeah, thank you so much both for your thoughts and ideas. And I'm really interested in the questions of like the narratives and the representation, and particularly when sort of settler narratives come into conflict with Indigenous narratives in that representation. So I just moved here recently from Edmonton, and one example that I'm thinking of is the mural in Grandin, the LRT station. And there's this great big mural, and you both seem to be acknowledging you know what I'm talking about, or yeah, but just for anyone who's not familiar, there's this big mural that existed for a long time. What still exists, the one side, and the one side was essentially depicting a residential school, and people kind of, it was effed up that it was there and the sort of narrative that it created. And there was lots of tension to get it taken down, but the local community was saying it's part of our history, et cetera, et cetera. And what's now happened is Aaron Paquette has a big mural that kind of is on the other side, and I don't know, it's been portrayed as like a response, but I was just wondering, yeah, what your thoughts are on things like that, where there is sort of that tension within a community.
Yeah.
Well, just, yeah, I mean, there's so many examples of being written out of this story. I mean, okay, yes, if you want a local example, and with all due respect to, you know, the city frustration with how so many missed opportunities. For example, the whole of the Southeast Falls Creek redevelopment, you know, around the Expo, Olympics time, the idea was to create kind of a sustainable village, which to me, I was working at the city at the time, presented the perfect opportunity to, okay, talk about sustainability, let's talk about land, let's talk about how did things become unsustainable in the first place. That was a very important place for local people. I've heard it was like, you know, the grocery store and a really important fishing place and so on. Let's really work with the local nations. Let's really get their presence there and have their narratives of sustainability. Let's get their language. There was even a chant, people were like, what should we name the streets? And I was like, get some Musqueam, you know, Hunkaminam words in there, all these opportunities. And even there was a public art process that was also done involving local nations. And to my knowledge, almost none of it happened. The history and the landscape that's celebrated there is relatively industrial. It's about the industrial past. The narrative of, you know, when you read the Heritage Report is basically the significance of that place is the industrial past. They said that they would allow Elder Larry Grant to name the remade island there in a Hunkaminam word, but then I went down there one day and it was called Habitat Island, and it was just like, here's this chance, you know, and again, the people have been erased. They've been written out of the story, you know, and I had so many different ideas of how that could have happened, and it's not up to me, but, you know, hoping to push that forward. So yeah, there's many examples of where we sort of continue to stick with that dominant narrative.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask about times when representations of Indigenous people seem to get pushed into a timeless past. And I'm thinking about, and maybe you know how it came about, I don't know, thinking about the YVR and the international arrivals, and we've got a primordial human zoo that is the representative of the First Nations of British Columbia. And I don't know if any First Nations were involved in designing it. I don't know if it's, some airport designer's idea of what should represent this place or not. But we have a lot of examples of that where Indigenous peoples are only supposed to be as they were in the past and not brought up into the modern contemporary world. The noble savages.
It's an interesting point of view, and I think with all those things, if the process is right, then the outcome is going to stand a better chance of being right. And unfortunately, I don't know the process that went on with the airport, so I can't comment on that. But I mean, that wouldn't be the only. There's other examples, museum representations. There's a cultural center outside, just on the outskirts of Saskatoon, called Wanaskewin Heritage Center, and it was curated largely by the local First Nations, and a lot of the staff and management and so forth carry that on. And you get a sense when you go in there, and even the design of the building and the food and the restaurant. I mean, everything. You can just get a sense. There's a lot of thought. There's a lot of sort of place-based meaning in what you're doing there and what you're seeing there and reading and hearing and overnight events that they hold and tours you can do in the river valley there. And then you go to other places where you don't get that impression, and I think a lot of it just has to do with process. I've seen one really recent little in terms of scale. They're doing some landscaping around the Shaw Conference Center in Edmonton, and they want it to be this great Indigenous sort of landscape design, and it sounds like it's coming along really well. But speaking with at least one First Nations organization representative, it sounds like it wasn't as comprehensive. I don't want to go too far with it because I'm kind of outside the process, but it sounds like there might have been one or two groups that should have been involved that may not have been in the actual design of the space. And if you get those kinds of details wrong, it's really hard to move forward with that space. Yet at the same time, you've got to be open to making some mistakes and correcting them. So if a group wasn't involved that is local to that place and that is their land, their traditional territory, and they weren't involved, then try and fix it after. It's just the work that we do in cities is so complicated. And I think in a way we have to be really diligent with the process, but we also have to be very forgiving and realize that sometimes when people don't do something perfect, it's not because they don't want to, it's because something fell off. They didn't consider something that they should have. And they're human, and you got to be able to go back and reiterate and develop. So, I don't know if that really answers your question, but
I'm thinking just real quick about the airport. I think a lot of people actually point quite proudly to that in the sense that, and the local people were quite involved, I think, and artists were quite involved, just in the sense that it really does convey a very rich sense of the culture that you're coming into, a sense of welcome. But I get your point, and I see that. I think it's more when it's not from within the community, and people kind of creating their own representations or their own ideas of what it should be. Because even if they are in a traditional style, they're made by contemporary people. They're made by people now who practice their art and their culture in their own way. It's part of this today. But I do think, yes, that the idea of what it is to be Musqueam or Indigenous or whoever you are has to be determined from within, and that will mean that the outcome will be much more representative and not that kind of fixed idea of the past. And yeah, I do think people expect that it has to be a certain way in order to be authentic, and that can definitely be problematic. And in terms of the being forgiving, I just think that's all the more reason why we have to continue to question the people who are sort of appointed as the caretakers of the city. And I think that's a really big, powerful privilege to have. And I think the fact that it's within a few people's hands who don't necessarily know those stories and don't know that history shows why those mistakes keep getting made. Not because, like you say, that they don't mean well, but because there continues to be this lack of really layered, deep knowledge of the places that they're making decisions for.
That's sort of aligned with what I want to know, adding to that question around, I really enjoyed reading the Urban Aboriginal Dialogue sort of report, and Vancouverites, or non-Indigenous Vancouverites being recognized as cultural romantics. So it's obvious that, you know, the great art pieces that we see around the city, you know, help provide Vancouverites with a sense that, you know, there is a rich history. However, I do think that there is a disconnect to that actual story of who lives here, like you were discussing earlier. So my question is, how do we build on that? So we have, you know, non-Indigenous people, visitors understand that there is, you know, a history here, and how do we actually provide that real story beyond the art? So, you know, there isn't this sort of sense that these people, you know, lived in the past or no longer live here or no longer, you know, thrive in this place.
My short answer to that is that the local people have a role in shaping their land, as they always have. So, and how that works is kind of up to working, you know, like you said, at the municipal level, you know, is whether that's building it in, where there's actually representation on council, representation in, you know, built into the staff. But basically, you know, I really look to the Tsleil-Waututh a lot in their approach. They have an approach of co-management, where they've mapped their traditional territory based on traditional use, and they say we're not going to just take parcels of land that are still available and then take money as compensation in places that we've lost. We want to maintain a say, a role, a presence, and a jurisdiction over all of our traditional territory. So gradually, they call it the variable interest model, I believe. They're gradually going to each jurisdiction, so whether it be hydro, whether it be a district or a city, and making partnerships. And they're working with those various bodies to say, we want to co-manage and be part of shaping our land. And they're doing that. So I think that's, to me, it's not, you know, little pieces that you buy, but it's actually, you maintain your title. You don't ever lose that. You maintain your connection to your land. It's just how do you reinstate that? And then the more that the local people are involved in that, the more they then can continue to be present. Videos are a really good way to do that too, and books and street names, and, you know, every way we can to affirm the presence.
Yeah, I think, and actually Kamal's points there just reminded me of one of the great limitations of talking too much about urban reserves is that it gives a sense that, you know, there's a principal reserve somewhere, and you can go and have a little reserve in the city too, but it kind of diverts attention away from the idea of traditional territory, and that's why it's important to think. I mean, it's a tool in the box, right? It's one thing that you can do, and it may work for you, and it may be a good thing for your community. Go do it, but you know, it's really about what I think is really interesting is seeing the re-territorialization of traditional territory. So you never lost it, but it's the reassertion, the replacing, getting that local meaning recirculating, you know, in that territory, and it's just a really powerful thing. You know, and another thing that comes up, I'll give you a quick Saskatoon example. You know, we got these sculptures that go up sometimes. One was a statue of the founders, John Lake from the Temperance colonies, and that was sort of the Western settler community, first one for Saskatoon. And there's a statue of the founders, and it's Chief Whitecap from the Whitecap Dakota First Nation, which is the closest reserve community to the city, just outside the city. The Assiniboine and the Cree were there long before, and Cree still very strongly present in that community in the Saskatoon region. And Whitecap Dakota were relative newcomers to the area, and we're talking, you know, decades settling that community decades before the temperance colonists came. And, but what gets commemorated so much is that Chief Whitecap met with John Lake and gave him advice and pointed to an area to settle that would be good for the temperance colonists. And so a lot of that First Nations story that you get in Saskatoon is about the Whitecap Dakota, and not to diminish their role as a local First Nation. It's a wonderful First Nation, huge part of our place history, but it's amazing what gets missed, you know, and it's most relevant because Chief Whitecap showed the temperance colonists where to put the city. So through that lens, it becomes very important. But if you look at the Métis, for example, the largest Métis community for a time in Saskatchewan, or at least one of the largest, was around Prairie Métis. And in the mid-1800s, there was about 30 families that wintered just outside of Saskatoon along the river, and then they would go back and forth between the Red River in Manitoba and around Winnipeg there now. And they go back and forth. And then later on in the 1800s, and they hunt bison. Then later in the 1800s, they packed up the Red River carts and moved permanently out to Round Prairie and stayed there in the Battle of Fish Creek around the Second Riel Rebellion due to kinship ties with the more sort of nationally famous Batoche Métis, Louis Riel, Gabriel Dumont. Through kinship ties with them, they fought alongside them at the Battle of Fish Creek, underwent the same kind of persecution. Many of those families had to move to Montana to escape settler justice, and then moved back to the Round Prairie community. And then in the early 1900s, by the end of 1930, they were pretty much fully urbanized in Saskatoon. And they were on road allowances in neighborhoods that are now developed. Some of our newest subdivisions, one called Stonebridge, was a place used to hunt, gather berries. They did a variety of things there. And there's a whole landscape within the developed Saskatoon that is the Round Prairie story of urbanization. And they're really a settler community, much like the temperance colonists for the city of Saskatoon. If you open up the history books on Saskatoon, you won't see a single reference to the Round Prairie Métis. Yet, the local, the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan local, Central Urban Métis Federation in Saskatoon, grew out of the Round Prairie Métis. And a couple of the neighborhoods were essentially primarily settled by Round Prairie Métis. And those names aren't represented in the neighborhood names, the street names. You won't find it anywhere. So, you know, there's a big imbalance between what we recognize in the urban landscape and what we don't. So
these will be the last two questions here, and I'm just conscious of the time, so if you can make it brief, thanks.
Thank you. My name is Chelsea Schmidtke. I'm also a Cree Métis in German from northern Alberta, specifically Big Stone Cree Nation under Treaty 8, just a few hours north of Athabasca. I wanted to say thank you for speaking to design details as you talk about identity and representation of Indigenous people in our cities. And I wanted to put in a little plug-in here. I'm in my third year of landscape architecture at UBC, and landscape architects are the people who are hired to design our spaces. They are the firms like architects who investigate the urban fabric and make those big decisions. I'm one of 2 Indigenous students in the program. I can probably count on one hand the amount of students who have graduated from the architecture and landscape architecture program at UBC who are Indigenous. And I just want to encourage people who are interested in the making of our spaces and places to investigate the making of those places and from an architectural, landscape architectural, or space designing perspective. We can make these decisions from Indigenous perspectives. That's something I'm actually studying in my graduate thesis project. If you are interested in learning more about that and what Grant Felgreen, one of my cohorts, who is the other Indigenous member in landscape architecture at this moment, we'll be presenting our graduation design projects in the spring of this upcoming year. So if you want to come and support us, critique us, just add to the dialogue, please investigate that. It'll be announced sometime in the spring. And I would also encourage you to maybe investigate also the people who are designing these spaces. So there will be public notices when a place is under development of who will be designing that place. They are required to hold public community consultation as part of those, where the designers get all the information that they need to know about that place. And that's probably where a lot of that breakdown happens. So get involved and go to those community meetings because they are so important. And if you are interested in this topic, investigate a career in landscape architecture maybe, because this is where you can really make a big impact on the shape of your city. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Hi there. I guess I wanted to speak to a little bit more about the issue of culture and urbanism, and how sort of seeing the sort of waves of migration into the city, not just in Vancouver or in North America, but all over the world, where we've gone past the 50% mark as a whole, and so we're becoming an urban society. And I'm wondering how cultures change, and in this case, Indigenous cultures change as they move from non-urban or rural or rural areas into urban areas, and how that shapes and affects their culture, so that it's not really almost a settler culture and an Aboriginal culture, but it's an urban culture versus a non-urban culture. And I was wondering if either of you could speak to a little bit about that.
I think firstly for me, I know when a lot of this research started to get more focus and attention, I do believe that Aboriginal people have always been urban in the sense of, since the cities have been in North America, Aboriginal people have always been present in those cities. So sometimes it's presented as kind of a new thing, not saying you do, but by some researchers. So I think, and also it's, as much as there's segregation, as much as our cities are based on segregation, there is a relative degree of also sharing and learning and cross-cultural kind of, exchange, I'd like to think. So I guess, personally, it's a good question. I actually have been working on a video that explores that very topic for the past 15 years. The whole idea of and this is why for me, our urban culture does need to change, because if you live in a culture that's based on interdependence, that's based on, whatever your various cultural teachings are, and you live in this kind of environment that does not make space for that and actually reflects something completely different, how do you reconcile that? And how do you live in that way? Or how can you also help to change the dominant culture? So it's an ongoing question. There's no easy answer, but I do personally believe that the reason why we're in this stage that we're in, with everything being unsustainable and, the kind of imbalances and inequality and struggles that people face living in the city, is because of colonialism. And the more that Indigenous people and cultures and voices can help shape how we live in the city, then actually, not to idealize or simplify, but there can be a bit more balance and a bit more kind of living within the ways of the land. But in terms of just urban culture in general, I think, we're all part of this society and we're all influenced by it, but we all, in our own ways, have to stay true to whatever our culture is and whoever our ancestors are, whatever our teachings are, and whatever that means to us. And just to go back to what Deborah said earlier, and always says, is, know where you come from. So you can live in any city, but having that sense of connection and a sense of your place and where you come from is probably what will help you kind of navigate all the hybridities and all the complexities of what we have to live with. That's all I can really come up with.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, just to add a little bit to that, I often liken my own family non-Aboriginal heritage, and I think, well, my great-grandparents, who I knew on one side of the family and who homesteaded outside of Saskatoon, in a rural municipality, built a farm and broke land, et cetera, et cetera. What does my culture have to do with theirs too in the city? And I mean, obviously there is a link and there's a trajectory, but Western culture changes in urban environments, and I mean, it should be no surprise that Indigenous cultures, as time goes on, change, and the term that was used here was hybridities, and I think that is really, I wouldn't even be able to begin to understand how Aboriginal cultures have changed in the city. I just don't have that insight. People have told me things. I don't know. They have more insight than I do. One concept that I like is by a guy, Chris Anderson at the University of Alberta. He's Métis from Prince Albert, and he wrote a paper on moving from discussions of cultural difference to cultural density. And so with difference, when you talk about difference, so say the difference that Aboriginalness makes or indigeneity makes, you almost feel like the goal is to understand how it's different. So, and I get people ask me that all the time when I was doing Aboriginal housing research, like, how is it different from non-Aboriginal housing? And I could think of a few examples, but I also just had to say, you have to go ask a tenant, you'd have to, and sometimes it isn't even something that they can tell you, it feels better. It just feels better. There's little things that people do. There's little differences. It might be the face you're looking at. It could be anything. And it's probably a combination of all kinds of things. And I can never really understand it fully. But if you stop trying to focus so much on understanding what the difference is and just appreciating that you want to increase the density of modern Indigenous hybridity, however it's combining and recombining in intercultural forms with all the things that are going on in our cities. That's a nice way to look at it. So from difference to density. And actually, if you want to read a good book on sort of cultural hybridity, I was forgetting the title of it. It's written by a guy named George Morgan. He's in one of the universities in Sydney, Australia. And he wrote a book called Unsettled Places, Aboriginal People and Urbanization in New South Wales. And he talks a lot about that, trying to grapple with how urban culture changes Aboriginal urban.
Well, I'd like to thank our speakers tonight very, very much for a really stimulating evening, and I hope that we'll have more of the same coming in urban studies in years to come. So thanks for getting this dialogue started for us. Thank you very much.